Is it over? I think it might finally be over.
You don't have to be poor anymore. Jesus is here.
The loudspeaker spoke up and said, Christianity is stupid.
Greetings, fellow worker slaves, podcasting at 128 kilobits from the Fortress of Squalitude near the Redneck Mecca. This is the Atheist in the Trailer Park podcast. I'm your host, Tucker. Professor Fuzznuts is in my lap, demanding attention. Not sure where Buttons is, probably harassing Leela. Yes, it's a podcast hosted by a guy and his cats. Get over it. And this, hopefully, will be the last of the slapdash episodes I have to put out, because it looks like the overtime is finally over. I went to work on Friday night. Clocked in, turned around to go put on my gear, saw a sign that said overtime had been canceled. So, I clocked back out, went home, and while I'm walking home, I'm thinking, hey, I can finally crank out a whole bunch of episodes that I need to be doing. Got home, and promptly fell asleep. In fact, for most of this weekend, that's all I've done. This past week, I had put in 5 12-hour days, so naturally I was a bit tired. I didn't realize quite how tired I was until, well, I realized I'd slept most of my weekend off. But I'm not complaining because I obviously needed to sleep. Now, the other big piece of news I have, possibly even the largest, is I have finally gotten caught up on all the back rent I owe my landlord, plus I'm a little bit ahead. Which, in the entire time I've lived here, that has now been all... Well, I moved in 99, so you can tell how long that's been. I've never been before. I've never been ahead on my rent. I've been on time, but I've never been ahead. Now, I'm ahead. Slightly. But, oh God, it feels so good. It feels so nice. Not to have to worry that I'm going to come home, find an eviction notice in the door, or how I'm going to pay this or that bill. I mean, I have paid, except for the bills that automatically hit my account that I have no control over, I have paid my rent, my electric bill, and, well, those are the big ones. I'm ahead on all of them, which never happens. I mean, normally I pay my electric bill at the last possible second because I just don't have the money. And I could do all of that without having to worry, hey, what am I going to have to give up this week to make this bill payment? Or what bill am I going to have to be late on to pay this one? Nope, don't have to do any of that. Don't have to do any of that. I've actually got some crap I needed for around the house. Not as much as I have to get, but I've gotten a few things. And if I can remember tomorrow, I'm going to stop and get some more because I do need them. And I can actually, I can think, I can feel. It's amazing. You know, unless you've been in these circumstances, you just have no idea what it's like to have half your brain shut down because you're so fucking stressed about day-to-day survival. Now I'm not doing that. It's amazing. So, what you're going to be getting in this episode is just a bit of random commentary on a number of different things. Sure, this is the burning question in everybody's mind. What's the deal with Leela? Well, she comes in every now and then, stays for a little while, and then decides she wants to go back out. Buttons and Fuzznuts still don't like her, and I'd much rather have her outside the house than inside. I know it's not the ideal situation, but I can't really take care of 3 cats, and I suspect, but I don't know, that she has feline leukemia. I had hoped to get Fuzznuts vaccinated this weekend, but it was raining on Saturday, So I couldn't do it. And plus, I was tired. I was just so tired. Sleeping was so much fun. I could sleep, not have to worry about what time I got up. It was beautiful. And by the time you hear this, Stormy Daniels' interview on 60 Minutes will have aired wherever you are. And I haven't watched it, but I've read the news accounts, because all the various news outlets had seen the interview before it aired and were embargoed on their review pieces, only being allowed to release them once the interview aired. If you paid any attention to the news at all up until this point, you already know what she's talked about. And what I don't understand, and what nobody brings up, is that back in 2011, Stormy Daniels gave an interview with a magazine or a newspaper, I forget which, and I'm not going to go dig for the article because Google makes that kind of shit so hard. But she gave an interview in 2011 talking about having sex with Trump. Now, and all the shit you're hearing about, all the salacious details that have been discussed so far, have come from that interview. The question you have to ask yourself is, why the hell wasn't that interview brought back to the public's attention during the campaign? That quite possibly could have torpedoed Trump's chances of being president. And you can forgive a few people involved for forgetting about that interview, but certainly not Stormy or the reporter who did it. So why did they keep their mouth shut? Stormy, maybe you can understand she got threatened, but the reporter, you got to ask the questions. And it's not like the reporter, was blocked, couldn't make it well known because, he couldn't get the rights, or she couldn't get the rights to reprint the article. This is the age of the internet, after all. All that reporter would have to have done is post a link to the article on their Facebook page or their Twitter account, or, they had the means to make that available. And I'm sure the reporter knew other reporters that they could point to the story and say, hey, you ought to do something about this, if it didn't get much traction. That didn't happen. Why? Why didn't that happen? That's a real question, and we should be asking it. And nobody is. Because, that article was known about. And how did I know about that article? Because a couple of months ago, somebody linked to it on Twitter. So, it's a failure of the media to bring this information to light, because obviously it's kind of important. I know the argument, he screwed her long before he was a presidential candidate. And that is true. But at the same time, we know when he did it, and that was shortly after Barron was born. So he was cheating on Melania with her. And one thing which... Hang on, I'm going to check something. Okay, I'm back. I just checked. What I did was I went to the Wayback Machine to look at Stormy's website years ago to see if I could find an answer to this, and I can't. But I know a number of porn stars will offer a service, hopefully you can hear the air quotes in that, where you pay them X amount of money, you get to have sex with them, they get to film it. And I'm quite sure that the reason they do this is to get around the whole prostitution laws. And I'd also be willing to bet that for well-moneyed clients, they would make the following deal, in that instead of putting the video and photographs on their website as they normally do for their paying customers, they will use a kill fee. They will take a kill fee and not put the images up on their website. So presumably, Trump paid her a kill fee for her not to publish any images that were taken of the two of them having sex. And presumably he would have thought that those images would be destroyed. I don't know. But, you know, I don't want to see the pictures. I really don't want to see the pictures, and I'm sure you don't either. But, you know, so that would explain why not only is there an NDA against Stormy, but also against her photographer. Because why the hell would you have an NDA against a photographer who wasn't there when the events took place? You know, of course, you also have to ask yourself, why would you have an NDA against somebody you didn't have sex with? Maybe because you did have sex with them. And that's really all I'm going to say about that. This thing is going to play out however it plays out. It doesn't appear that, at least from what I can tell, that Trump has been on a Twitter rage, so I guess they hid his phone from him. Okay. As many of you may know, Skullbeard and I have finished 4 Maccabees. That episode hasn't gone out yet because I just haven't had time to do the editing on it. So that leaves just a couple of things left. Well, leaves one thing that I know of left in the Apocrypha to read, at least as far as the Ethiopian Apocrypha goes. And that is, I forget the name of the books. There's 3 of them, but they've all been translated into Rastafarian, not standard English. So they're going to be an entertaining read, needless to say. And which means the next step will be the Pseudegraphica. So I've been trying to find something to do a little research on the Pseudegraphica before I dive into it, because I literally know nothing about it. And after going through the Apocrypha with the scant knowledge that I had, I find that, you know, I want to have a better understanding of the Pseudegraphica before I jump into that. However, that does not seem to be possible. I have been looking for works on the Pseudegraphica just to explain things and how they ended up in the, you know, why they weren't included in the biblical canon, how influential they may have been, who some of the authors may have been, things like that. I cannot find anything from a source that I would consider reliable. In doing a search on Amazon for books about it, they all seem to be just compilations of various pseudegraphical works, or if there's commentary on the Pseudegraphica, they're almost all, well, actually all that I can find really is done by religious scholars. And when I say religious scholars, I mean they are not atheists who study religion. They are, you know, devout Christians who study religion. So that is, you know, I'm hesitant to get one of those books and read it because, well, that's an unreliable narrator. They're going to overlook a few things. I did find that Bart Ehrman had a book about it called Forged. Forged, writing in the name of God, why the Bible's authors are not who we think they are. And it covers mostly, at least so far, I'm only into like the third or fourth chapter of the book. It covers mostly the New Testament books. There are some mentions of the Apocrypha and the Pseudegraphica in it, but not a lot so far. One of the things that bothers me about the book is, like, the first 2 chapters of it are spent by Ehrman simply defining what he means by forgery. And I guess that's important for somebody just walking into the concept of forged biblical text cold. But I can't really imagine too many people are going to pick up a book by Bart Ehrman and not have the idea that, hey, maybe the authorship of these books shouldn't be trusted. I can certainly see the place for some discussion on the topic, because you do need to separate out the people who were writing a book that later got somebody else's name attributed to it from people who knew that they, who were pretending to be somebody else. That I can understand. But like I said, 2 whole chapters on it, and in some cases rather excruciating detail on the subject, I just don't see the need for. I will say I did learn something very interesting from that book, and it comes from early in the text where Ehrman explains what is actually meant by apologetics. And as I have often joked in the past, that seems like a really bad name for what you're trying to do. But here's what Ehrman says about the term. The term apologetics comes from the Greek word apologia, which does not mean apology in the sense you're saying sorry for something. It means instead to make a reasoned defense of the faith, which, okay, that's a good argument for using that term. However, the connotations of that term are such that I would think that you probably ought to avoid it. Unless, of course, you want to do the whole, sorry, my God says weird stuff, but that's kind of the way it is. But as to the stuff I've been learning from the book, one of the things I've learned is apparently there's not really a good compilation of all the texts that make up the Pseudepigrapha. I had one website which I thought, hey, this appears to have everything. Certainly has everything that I've heard of. Nope. In reading the text, I find there's other books that it mentions that aren't linked to on that site. I will attempt to find them because one of them, at least, is rather interesting. The summation of the story that Ehrman gives, that's in part of the text, is somewhat empowering for women. In it, a woman by the name of Felka, who is, described as being very beautiful and the daughter of like an aristocrat or something like that, hears the preachings of Paul, and this Paul is saying no sex under any circumstances, even if you're married. You want to be pure to go up to heaven. Well, she is enraptured by this idea, tells her family and her fiance, nope, I'm done being, an ordinary woman, blah, blah, blah. I'm going to go follow Paul. They're upset about this and try to dissuade her, but of course nothing works. She goes and follows Paul. And at one point, she becomes a prisoner of somebody and is going to be put to death. Terrified of this, or terrified that she could die without being baptized, she finds some water, baptizes herself, and is then freed, due to a miracle of God. She then goes and meets back up with Paul, tells him her story and of the miracle. Paul says, oh my God, this is absolute proof of, everything I've been saying. You truly are a, apostle of God. You've been blessed by God. You're allowed to go out and preach and, do miracles and all that other bullshit. So, yes, I know it has, that a woman can't have children and sex is evil in it, but it does have one of the few, if not the only, accounts in a biblical-esque work that advocates for women to go out and preach the gospel. And of course, this is in contradiction to one of Paul's, it's 2 Timothy, I think it is, in the New Testament, where Paul says, I forbid women from holding any authority over men or to preach the gospel or to even speak in church. So, and it's not really clear when this book was written. And that story is not on the website that I was going to be using. So I've managed to find a few, I found it elsewhere, but it's taken some work to do it. Not a huge amount of work, but you'd think that sites which say, hey, we've got all these, religious texts would have that, but they don't. And this one site that I had been using for a lot of this stuff has it listed, but doesn't have the text there itself. It mentions it by name, but doesn't have it doesn't have the text at all, let alone the complete version. Strange. And one other thing that I'm getting from this book, I really don't think that anyone out there has a good view of what the early world or early Christian history was like and fully entails. And this isn't a slam against Ehrman's scholarship. I just think it's so complex that nobody can fully ingest it all. And unfortunately, it doesn't seem to me, at least from what I've been able to discover, that anyone has been able to put together. One person says, hey, I'm going to tackle this. And another person says, okay, now that the first person has done that, I'm going to build upon that and tackle these other aspects and have a couple of people do that, in such a way that you can pull all those books together or writings and get a cohesive image of the whole era. Because I really can't explain it, because like Ehrman in the book, he brings up some old religious leaders and talks about them whom I've heard of, but most people would never have heard of unless they've been really, really into the obscure aspects of the early church history. But for a lot of the church history, he doesn't cite any contemporary scholarship on the matter. He cites an older work by Eusebius called The Church History, which is a 10-volume set that purports to discuss the history of the church, the first few centuries of the church. Now, we know that this work is inaccurate. Eusebius was writing centuries after the founding of the church. He made a number of assumptions based on lore that we know to be incorrect. And while I can understand referring back to Eusebius for some detail, there's no recognition in the book so far that, Eusebius got a lot of shit wrong, and we probably should take what he says with a very large grain of salt in many, many areas. In fact, I would consider the work so unreliable that you shouldn't refer to it at all, but something more modern, which has, things from the archaeological record. I saying this somewhat out of my ass because I've not read Eusebius's work, so I'm not entirely familiar with it. But I do know that there are, a number of things we found out that have long been believed about the early history church, and now in recent decades discovered they're not true. That it's impossible for them to have been true. So, that puts such a taint on the work in my mind that one probably shouldn't use it at all if there's another source out there. And, I don't know what to conclude from Ehrman's writings as to whether or not there is a better source out there. It may be that nobody has sat down and gone through all the modern articles in academic journals about the early history of the church and, synthesized a new work out of them, giving you a history of the church that's as accurate as we could possibly have. It would be an arduous undertaking, I'm sure, but it seems to me it's kind of an important one. Not only from the atheist perspective that it shows, hey, these guys are, full of shit as to what they said, but also, from a Christian perspective, because, they all want to know where they came from, blah, blah, blah. But again, it's like the whole thing with the Apostle Paul. These, the statements made and even discussed by Ehrman to some degree is that, Paul eventually went to Rome where he was executed by the Romans. But despite the fact that the Romans were excellent record keepers, and we have a lot of records from that particular time, there is no mention of anyone like Paul getting executed. And you would think that this would have shown up and that people would have tried to find it. I mean, we know there are forgeries of letters between Paul and the Roman philosopher Seneca, because people were trying to say, well, Seneca knew of Paul, so that's proof Paul was alive, blah, blah, blah. But, nobody seems to be going for actual documentation or, saying, hey, wait a minute. Since there's no documentation on this, maybe it isn't true that Paul went to Rome and was executed by the Romans. Maybe that's just a myth. Maybe something else happened to him. Maybe there never really was any individual named Paul, and that the stories we have by Paul and the letters we have by someone, claiming to be Paul are actually like the Gospels, written by an entirely different person and attributed to Paul. I don't know. He does, however, and one thing I will give him credit for, he does, however, do some excellent demolition of the whole concept that the New Testament works were originally written in Aramaic. Because he points out that several of the works, the only way they could have been written by an Aramaic speaker is if that Aramaic speaker went and learned Greek and then not only learned how to speak it and how to write it, but learned the colloquialisms and other little wordplay things that native speakers do. So, that kind of puts paid to the whole idea that, oh, no, these were originally written in Aramaic. I mean, he says, and I think rather convincingly, that Paul would have had to have been illiterate, and describes, at least illiterate in Greek. Though Paul may have been able to have some rudimentary reading and writing abilities in Hebrew or Aramaic. And I'm just going to point out, this is one of the fun things about having a cat. While I was in the middle of talking, Buttons hopped up into my lap, managed to somehow bump the stop button, and I didn't realize it while I was talking, and so had to stop and back up and find out where I left off, which means you lost some material. Blame the cat, don't blame me for that one. But as I said earlier, and you may have heard or not, Paul, the writings of Paul are, they have to have been written by a native Greek speaker, because the colloquialisms and other things like that that Paul used are the things that only a native Greek speaker would have used, and they don't work if you were originally writing in Aramaic or Hebrew and then they were translated into Greek. You would have to have a very sophisticated translator who shifted sayings from those original languages to Greek to try and translate the meaning. And that's not an easy task. One thing I've always remembered about how, colloquialisms work is, in English we have the one like, the early bird gets the worm. Well, the closest the Chinese have to that kind of saying is the early bird gets shot. Entirely different implications from that saying than the English version of it. So, if you're going to translate the early bird gets the worm into Chinese, you have to, use something like he who gets there firstest with the brownest nose or something along those lines. You just can't say, use a common term or a common phrase in Chinese that's sort of related, because the point is lost. And now Buttons has moved to my lap, demanding attention. Yes, she's a sweet, yes, war. Fat cat. Fat. Fat. Okay, Dave, that's enough, Lurvins. You gotta get down so Daddy can think. Yes, get down. Good girl. But, the more I read the book, and I guess it shouldn't be surprising considering that Ehrman's an atheist, the more I become convinced that, there was nothing at all to Christianity and that it's all made up bullshit. But Ehrman's biases no doubt play a part into how he shapes his narrative. Still, he does use scientific methodology for a lot of his arguments, so it's like, I cannot imagine a Christian scholar having much in the way of opposition to what he says. And indeed, he quotes a number of Christian scholars to support his arguments. So that always, it's like, whoops, well, even if you guys admit this, there's got to be a problem here. Okay, so let me go over a few other things, then I'm going to have to shuffle off out of here because I've got to get ready for work. I should have been able to do this episode a lot sooner, but I went to Waffle House for my breakfast, and unfortunately the cook on the grill was new and inexperienced, so it took forever for me to get my food. I spent my time reading Ehrman's book while I was waiting. Yes, I read it on the Kindle. I didn't have the paperback out there. In Waffle House, in the middle of a highly religious town in the South, because that probably would have caused problems. Of course, the nice thing about Waffle House is, you can tell that the cook spits in your food because you'll see him doing it. I know I'd said I was going to try to get out a bonus episode this week. Obviously, that didn't happen. I wasn't planning on working 12-hour days every day. Usually, the past month or so when I've been doing all this overtime, there would be at least 1 or 2 days a week where I didn't put in a full 12 hours. Some days I'd get off at after 8 hours. Other days, it'd be 9. But this past week, it was a full 12. So I just didn't have the opportunity, and when I was off work, of course, I was sound asleep. Also, haven't gotten a Patreon-only episode out. I apologize for that, but I believe y'all can understand that. I'm not going to project how work is going to go this week because I simply just don't know. It may be that when I get in there, I find, we're back to 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, or, we're only going to get 32 hours. I won't know anything at all until I get there, and just because it goes one way tonight doesn't mean it's going to go the same way the rest of the week. However, I will do my best if I have the time to get out some other episodes. Skullbeard and I, we've got at least 2 episodes in the can of the last of the Apocrypha. Callie was very kind. She recorded one of the sessions at NanoCon, and she's made that recording available. I've got it downloaded, but I haven't had a chance to, edit it or anything like that, correct the audio, because she just gave everybody the raw audio file. I will try and get that out at some point so you guys can hear that. This is not the session, however, where she told me to shut up, so you won't get to hear that little gem. And yes, she said it with love. Callie says everything with love, so I wasn't upset by it at all. There is a news article that I want to get to that I can think of off the top of my head that I had seen here recently that I think is pretty interesting and has some implications that I haven't seen discussed in any of the topics I've seen on it. And I will have a link to this in the show notes. It comes from space.com. A star grazed our solar system 70,000 years ago, and early humans likely saw it. Some distant objects in our solar system bear the gravitational imprint of a small star's close flyby 70,000 years ago, when modern humans were already walking the Earth, a new study suggests. In 2015, a team of researchers announced that a red dwarf called Schultz's star apparently grazed the solar system 70,000 years ago, coming closer than 1 light year to the Sun. For perspective, the Sun's nearest stellar neighbor these days, Proxima Centauri, lies about 4.2 light years away. The astronomers came to this conclusion by measuring the motion and velocity of Schultz's star, which zooms through space with a smaller companion, a brown dwarf or failed star, and extrapolating backward in time. Schultz's star passed by the solar system at a time when early humans and Neanderthals shared the Earth. The star likely appeared as a faint reddish light to anyone looking up at the time, researchers with the new study said. This new study bolsters the 2015 analysis with a different type of evidence. A research team led by Carlos de la Fuente Marcos of the Complutense University of Madrid analyzed 339 known star system bodies with hyperbolic orbits, paths through space which are V-shaped rather than circular or elliptical. Objects on hyperbolic orbits could theoretically have come from interstellar space, just like Oumuamua, the first known solar system visitor born around another star. And I want to point out that they think that Oumuamua originally came from a binary star, like, a fictional example of a binary star that most people would be familiar with would be Tatooine from the Star Wars movies. But they could also be natives nudged into weird tracks by gravitational interactions with the sun or some of its planets, and denizens of the Oort cloud, a frigid ring far from the sun that's home to trillions of comets, could even be perturbed by the Milky Way's disk or wandering stars that get too close. Using numerical simulations, we have calculated the radiance or positions in the sky which all these hyperbolic orbit objects seem to come, de la Fuente Marcos said in a statement. In principle, one would expect those positions to be evenly distributed in the sky, particularly if these objects come from the Oort cloud, he added. However, what we find is very different. Statistically significant accumulation of radiance, the pronounced overdensity appears projected in the direction of the constellation of Gemini, which fits with the close encounter with Schultz's star. Now, and they say Oumuamua didn't come from there, so because of its based on its orbital or its interstellar trajectory. When I read this, it something in me twitched. I was like, that time period seems familiar. That time period roughly corresponds, because of course we don't have a precise dating of either of these events, the Toba super eruption. Now, this is thought to be the cause of the genetic bottlenecks seen in human DNA. At some point in human history, and they believe it was 70,000 years ago, some big event happened which caused the population of humans on the Earth to crash to, at most, less than 3,000 members of the species. Now, there's some debate as to whether or not the Toba explosion was actually large enough to be the trigger event, or if the if that's exactly when the bottleneck occurred. But the evidence that there was a bottleneck in human history where the population went from one size to a much larger size and then began to grow back is indisputable. It's just the causes for it aren't entirely known. Now, I'm not going to propose that something happened when Schultz's star passed by our solar system that caused the population levels to shrink. That may be the case, but there's no evidence saying that or even hinting at that, so we can't conclude that. However, this is what I'm thinking. There are, and I cannot remember the sources for it, but there are an awful, we know that an awful lot of religious stories in various religious traditions all spring from a common root. If you have an unusual event like a star appearing in the sky that has never been seen before, and some kind of natural disaster that wipes out most of the population, then, you're going to get a lot of, in a society that's not sophisticated, you're going to get a lot of religious connotations from those events. Perhaps it was this event that seeded most of the elements of the various religions we know today. And then as the population expanded and moved out from wherever they were at the time on the earth, assuming it was only one population that survived, it may be that there was the total number of humans was 2,500 or 33,000, but they were in different pockets around, one particular continent, but probably not the globe, since we don't really have any evidence for modern humans being in the Americas at that point in time. It may be that those pockets or pocket of humanity were, that was the seed point for all the religions, and it was at that point that we got what we got as far as religious stories go. And if there were any groups that had wildly different religious tales than what we know today, those all died out, and it was only that small group that survived. I don't know. That's just speculation on my part, but it seems, with a population reduction at that same period of time, you would have, and a star appearing in the sky that's never been seen before, you would have an influence on the cultures that existed. And it may be the case that the star appeared before the disasters, or it may be the case that the star appeared after the disasters or during the disasters. No way of knowing. It would be really interesting to figure that out, because maybe the star, just spitballing here, let's say that the star appeared before the disaster, shortly before the disaster, and then the disaster occurs. Well, everybody takes that star appearing in the sky as a sign, warning them of the disaster, and they just didn't recognize it. Or, it appears after the disaster, and they take it as a sign that, there's still a God watching over them, or that, that the star that appeared is actually an evil God, and he's responsible for all that. No way of knowing, of course, but that's just some interesting speculation, I think. Now, if you want to go wholly into the realm of science fiction, I'm just going to throw this out there because it's a fun little story idea. In Anne McCaffrey's The Dragon Riders of Pern series, there is the people live on this planet called Pern with dragons, and there's a companion planet near them called, which I forget the name of it, but the orbits come close every so many years, and when they get close, there are these spores that are flung out from the planet that come to Pern and bring devastation to the planet if they're allowed to hit the ground and, propagate. So the inhabitants of Pern ride dragons that fly into the sky and burn spores out of the sky as they fall. Because they're big, long, ribbon-like things, not microscopic organisms. So just throwing this out there, maybe when Schultz's star passed close to our solar system, something came from its companion planet that is what wiped everything out here, or, what cut down the human population. No possible way of knowing if that happened or what it might have been, but it's just a fun little thing to think about. All right. I'm going to have to sign off here because I do have to get ready for work, and I've got to get this thing edited and posted tonight. Again, I apologize for not being able to get out anything earlier, but I think y'all can understand. Depending on how this week goes, you may get everything that I've been promising and have in the can, or you may not get anything until next Sunday. I can't tell you. And even if I go in tonight and we do 8 hours, that doesn't mean we're going to do 8 hours tomorrow night. Or, I may go in tonight and they may say, you get to go back home again, which I would not complain about. I have a whole lot of shit to do around this house that I haven't been able to get to. I got to some of it this weekend, but not very much, because I was, like I said, sleeping. I mean, I got my laundry done and folded, but I haven't gotten it put away, which contents Fuzznuts to no end because he's now curled up on one of my shirts, snoring contentedly. Yes. I love the little bastard some days. All right. Well, thanks for listening, and I will talk to y'all as soon as I can.
That's it for this episode of The Atheist in the Trailer Park Podcast. You can subscribe to the show on iTunes, Stitcher, as well as just about anywhere else podcasts can be found. Many of the episodes are also on YouTube. Follow the show on Twitter. @TParkAtheist is the show's Twitter handle. It's on Facebook at facebook.com/trailerparkatheist.com. If you happen to like the podcast, please rate it on iTunes. If you'd like to support the podcast, there's a donate button on the show notes page. You can support it via Patreon at patreon.com/TNTucker. Thanks for listening.
Say goodnight, Fuzznuts.
All I know is this violates every canon of respectable broadcasting.
Damned cat.